Hello everybody, welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. I got a question for you. How certain are you that the community that you live in is going to be just like it is in 5 years, 10 years? Will it be here in 25 years or 50? That's the topic of our show today as we discuss community resilience. It is something that most people don't think of because they just think life is going to go on. But it's something that city planners and engineers have to think about all the time. Let's start with a historical perspective of what this looks like. Here's Derek Dowsett.
Throughout history, groups of people have banded together to increase their chances of survival. That story used to be far more black and white in its telling, while today, that story has more gradation and color. Its roots remain the same. Richfield, Utah was settled in 1864 as an agrarian hamlet where the fields were rich.
They said you could drive in a 10-penny nail at night and you'd have a crowbar the next day. That's how rich the soil was.
The secret to sticking around on the map instead of being lost to the pages of history has been resiliency. That ability to bounce back looks different everywhere you go, but boils down to an ability to adapt to change.
We've seen other communities grow in leaps and bounds in southern Utah even, and sometimes the building gets in front of the planning. And so we're trying to make sure that we plan correctly so that we don't get down the road 20 years and say, if we only had done it this way, it would have been so much better. So that's a really a balancing effort because you're trying to balance growth that you want to come, and you don't want to say, no, we're not ready, but you want to make sure that you do it right first time.
We've seen a lot more influx of people coming in and moving in. So one of the things that we've been looking at is updating our general plan to make sure that when we grow in an orderly way and in a way that makes sense and in a way that's helpful and that we can provide infrastructure for.
Growth isn't the only challenge. There are immediate threats, such as natural disasters, or the more gradual issues, such as the economy and social change. Changes to the economy are playing out in Richfield, as they are in many of Utah's communities that have grown up around natural resources, such as coal.
Historically, that's really generated a lot of jobs in our area, not just because of the coal mine, but also because of the trucking companies, plus the tax revenue that it generates for our community and the mineral lease revenues that we're able to apply for to help us with infrastructure projects. We would lose all of that as well. So it's kind of a big deal, and we've worked a lot with the county trying to diversify and find ways to bring industry in.
How does that change what communities plan for when they plan for resiliency?
Planning for resiliency requires you to understand where the community's at today. It also requires you to understand where the community's trying to get to. Poor planning is making the assumption that you can go directly from where you're at to where you're trying to get in a linear way. Reality is it's a circuitous path, and you need to kind of have that experience to understand that sometimes you'll take a sprint forward to get to that goal, and sometimes you actually fall backwards for no fault of your own.
Sometimes communities don't realize that the most important thing is to bring clean water in and take gray water out and make sure that we have roads and fire and police protection. Everybody needs a community to be from and to come home to.
For the County Seat, I'm Derek Dowsett.
Thank you, Derek. We appreciate that report. We're going to take a break, join our panel of experts here, and get into the discussion of how we make sure that our future for our communities looks as strong as we feel today. We'll be right back on the County Seat. Welcome back to the County Seat. We are having a talk today about community resilience and building resilient communities. Joining us for conversation is somebody at the, as we were saying before the show, at the 30,000 foot level, who is a regional director for an engineering firm who works with a lot of communities. Ted Mickelsen, who is with Jones and DeMille. You are a regional director for the engineering firm, right?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. We have Kari, who is a city council member at Woodland Hills. And joining us is Norm Beagley, who is the assistant city manager of Santaquin. Thank you for taking the time to come talk to us about this. You know, as we're prepping for this show, it's easy for me to put my head around having a resilient community as the community itself has to take care of it. But until just now, I never thought about the fact that what happens in Woodland Hills might have some impact on Santaquin, who lives next door. I would like to explore that a little bit as part of this conversation.
So maybe I can start off with that, Chad. You know, some of the things we're seeing with these communities, like you say, that are especially neighboring communities, and more frequently, is we're dealing with natural disasters. For example, Woodland Hills and Santaquin were both impacted by the Pole Creek Bald Mountain fires in September 2018, which as part of that is a natural disaster in itself. But following that, then you get flooding that comes from that disaster, which is another natural disaster that you're dealing with, that these communities are dealing with. So as more and more time goes on, we're dealing with, it seems like more and more natural disasters that are impacting more and more communities. But in addition to that, we're also seeing these communities that are looking to become more resilient in their establishment as a community. They're also dealing with aging infrastructure and trying to rebuild their infrastructure to continue to be resilient. And some of the things that brings to the table is, how do we plan for this, especially when it's a natural disaster? They're difficult to plan for. And how do we plan to fund this when these natural disaster or even just infrastructure issues that they have to deal with come to light? So I think in working with the multitude of communities that we work with, that's a lot of things that we're facing today with helping these communities become strong and long-established communities.
I look down the road, from you, go over the hill, Eureka. That used to be a thriving community, and it struggles now. And you go a little bit further and you come to Ophir, or you go to a couple of those other towns on the west side of that mountain that had big mining communities, and they're just nothing but boarded up buildings. What kind of things do you have to think of in your communities right now that deal with that sort of stuff?
Well, I think that part of resiliency is the planning. Your community needs to have a confidence in their leaders that we have been going forward in planning. You know, before the fires, that was a huge impact to our community. We were evacuated for 2 weeks. But why was it that our community allowed us to evacuate them? It wasn't just the threat of the fire, it was the trust they have in leadership to say, I trust that you're telling me what I need to know. And so whether it's natural disaster, whether it's aging infrastructure, water, that takes money and the planning that comes in. Now that's where the kind of conflict comes. People want services, but it's hard to buckle down and pay for those. And so by planning it out in advance and maybe coming to another agreement, then citizens can feel confident that that money has been spent wisely, and that there's transparency there, and that it is really for their quality of life.
And I would concur, the funding is probably our biggest challenge. We can plan and we can create the best plans that we can possibly create, but without the funding to build the infrastructure, that's probably our biggest challenge as a municipality, to be able to come up with that funding and how we help protect the citizens and help build that resiliency that we're talking about.
What kind of role does an engineering firm play in this? I mean, money makes the world go around. You design a project for them, it's going to cost them money. They're going to, you've got contractors, you've got all of your work, which sometimes is a bigger lift than actually building the bleachers at the school, is making sure you can build them correctly. So what kind of an impact does that have at trying to help to get these things moving?
Funding is as Norm and Kari mentioned, is sometimes the biggest hurdle to overcome in building these communities. And there are sources out there. So one of the things that we have to do in helping these communities as an engineering company is we have to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of these funding mechanisms, funding agencies. For example, this project that we're completing that impacted both Santaquin and Kari, or Woodland Hills, for the fire, is roughly first phase of it's roughly about $8 million. And there's another $8 million to be spent over the next few years, putting in measures in place to protect these communities from the burn scars. And so we have to kind of keep our pulse on these funding mechanisms, and not only just where to go to get the funding through the federal and state agencies, but also how to navigate those funding sources.
I think that's an interesting aspect to take to this, is that we talk about $8 million. You know, I live in Holiday, part of Salt Lake County, where that's nothing. How many people live in Woodland Hills?
We have 1,500.
Okay.
And so it's really a small community, and yet because we have large lot sizes, and so geographically we have some space there. We're right up in the mountain, and so everything that happens there impacts every single citizen that is there. And kind of like what Ted said, funding, we always hear, well, there's plenty of funding out there. Well, federal funding comes with a lot of red tape. It also is in its silos. So if your project doesn't fit their silo, then we're sorry, it doesn't happen. And so after the fire, one of the things that Ted was able to help us with was not only the NRCS funding, which is what was assigned to us after the disaster, because our city did not burn to the ground, our county. We were assigned to NRCS funding, which has its own watershed protection. But then Ted said, hey, I'm not sure we're going to get all the money we need. We should apply for a FEMA grant as well. So we did both, and we were the only community that did both. But we are glad we did, because NRCS on the federal level had to cut back on our project. And so we wouldn't have been able to complete the whole thing without both funding streams.
This whole conversation so far has been how we dealt with a natural disaster, which is part of it. How much of your brain power and your sleepless nights as community leaders goes to trying to make the community resilient on an economic level?
Yeah, so we have that same concern. I do have sleepless nights. I was up night before last and morning before last at 1:30 thinking about things that I needed to do. But one of the things that we look at is we try to figure out how we can increase our commercial base is one of the ways that we look at doing that. And it's very hard for us. We have 15,000 residents plus or minus, so quite a bit different. But again, I think we have more economic opportunity than maybe Woodland Hills does, but we certainly don't have the economic development opportunity that a Spanish Fork or a Provo or an Orem have. And so we all have our own challenges in different ways, but that is one of the ways that we try to become more resilient and less reliant upon things like property taxes and fees, is to try and build our commercial base.
And I think that's a great point that Norm makes, Chad, is as communities, I think you want to try and diversify. You know, that's in the engineering industry, that's what we try and do as well, is we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket, because if that basket sinks, you know, you go with it. So you try and diversify your income or your resources, which helps you sustain that resiliency when there are varying type of hardships that you might face.
My head's swirling right now.
Well, and that was something that the state government had in place for quite a long time, was diversifying your cities and your towns, and trying to come up with ways that you can make sure that you're a well-rounded community, so that if mining dries up, or if leasing dries up, or if economic development of one industry or another dries up, you still have something bringing in that income. Having that big vision picture of how are we going to be sustainable as a community. I think we're seeing, I guess we're seeing a mindset change with citizens, because there are times where some citizens are really stuck in their place, and they say, we don't want change, and yet change is inevitable. And so you have to bring that message to the community on what is really our purpose and our mission of our community, and how do we see ourselves long-term, not just in the next year or two, but really long-term sustainability.
This was a conversation they had out in Frisco many, many years ago, and now all that's left is the kiln. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with the county seat, continue our conversation. There's much more to cover. You're watching the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. We're having a conversation today about resilient communities and how you get there. How much influence, both of you have talked about the fact that you stay up nights and you're working on planning. You engage an engineer. But what happens when policy takes a different turn and all of a sudden your 30-year plan has a big impact in it because some clown 2,000 miles away has totally changed how you're going to interact in the community around you with water policy or forest policy. How do you deal with that?
Norm, you want to take it first?
You know, that's an interesting concept because we deal with unfunded mandates from the state a lot. We deal with unfunded mandates from the federal government a lot. And quite frankly, sometimes we just have to figure out how to navigate those without causing ourselves more pain and headache in the process. And it is a challenge, I'll be honest with you. We have times where we just have to sidestep landmines, et cetera, just because the feds or the state have now come down with a policy that we have to figure out how to make it work.
And we follow along with all of those. Well, on the federal level, it's much harder because they can pass regulations that don't necessarily go through Congress, and so you have to keep up on regulation. Then you have the state statute. I mean, we just finished the legislative session, over 1,000 bills. 500 of those had an impact on local municipalities.
But couldn't another municipality or county also have an impact on what you're trying to do in planning?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for us, Spanish Fork does anything with business and or their infrastructure, it affects our citizens because they drive through there or they work there. And so, yeah, we notice an impact.
Toll road by the windmills would be a real problem, wouldn't it? What tools are in the toolbox to help these guys?
Well, so one of the things that we've been working on is it's a platform that we use, a web-based platform called CivicLink that we make available for communities. Something where they can house their documents. For example, there are certain documents that are required, even by the federal government, that help communities understand their resiliency. Through the EPA, they do risk assessments that communities are required to do on their water systems. So this platform is a way for them to be able to make these documents available to the public to understand the resilience of their community and help them view these things. And I think this is important for that, what Kari talks about, that public buy-in, right? So helping them see what their leadership is doing. And it also gives them a way to give them input into the resilience or the direction of their community as they go forward.
As I've been working a lot more closely with really small communities, not just counties in the last little while, I realize how few resources sometimes they have. And so it seems to me that something like this is of great value to you.
It is. We have the partnership that we've had with TED, especially for our city, has really helped us. It helps give us the confidence and also just the knowledge, because there's so much out there and we can only have so much time in the day to research it all, and so it's nice to have that kind of partnership.
Absolutely. We rely on just about every source of information and help that we can possibly get, just because we don't have the resources to do it all ourselves, and we don't have the resources to necessarily even know where to look half the time.
Excellent. We're going to take one more break. We'll come back for our last segment here on the County Seat. We're talking about resilient communities, how you get there, how engineering and planning and cities and citizens all kind of work together to make sure that you don't become a pariah, which is a historical, the guys in Kane County, you'll get that. We'll be right back on the County Seat. Welcome back to the County Seat. We're having a conversation today about resilient communities and how small communities around the state, even big ones, cross that bridge and get there. We ended this last segment by talking about tools in the toolbox. What kind of advice do you have, all three of you from your different perspectives, about what flexibility it's going to take to get yourselves to fact where Woodland Hills will still be here in 25 years and Santaquin will still have a main street in 25 years.
Yeah, I'd go back to what Kari said. It's all about good planning and trying to find the financial resources to put those plans in place so that you can be sustainable.
I also think we should add in communication. That's an important factor with your citizens. They want to know what's happening, and although they may come from one extreme to the other, I mean, right now on a national level, there's a lot of distress, as Norm said earlier, for elected officials. But by having a good communication plan and being consistent in that plan, that's what builds the resiliency, is consistency.
What do you see from an engineering standpoint? Because you deal with all these guys, or a vast majority of them. I know you'd like to deal with all of them, but a vast majority of them. From an engineering standpoint, what do you see?
Well, and that's an interesting because it's a concept that's been kind of floating around the last little while, and it's an old adage, an old quote that says, "Don't kick the can down the road." And that's something we've been preaching the last little while because these communities are starting to have the impacts of political changes, aging infrastructure, whatever it might be. If they've been kicking that can down the road, not planning and planning for funding, then they're dealing with an emergency. And that's when the communities start to get that distrust or they start to sink as a community. So that is probably the thing we've been trying to share mostly is start the process now, start planning now, and plan for these this resiliency, overcoming these changes.
And so if somebody gets themselves in that frame of mind and they say we want to do it, are there tools to help them get started on it?
And there are. We often work with, we have a couple of tools in our toolbox. We use a funding finder app, which I know has, been on the program before, to help communities find funding through different agencies depending on the type of projects they have. The one we mentioned a little bit ago, the Civic Link, the platform for housing documents. But as much as that, reach out to these agencies. They can, or your engineering companies that you might use, they can help you guide through this process because it does get to be a little bit complex.
Yeah, particularly when you've got another job and it's all part-time. People don't realize how thankless the work is of civic government. So thank you all for taking your time to come here. We appreciate it. And thank you for joining us. County government is where your life happens. Be involved, be part of it. Share this with your friends, and let's get a discussion going. We welcome your comments on social media. See you next week on The County Seat.